Everything the United States Army had drilled into Captain James Miller about owning the fight wasn't just imperfect. In the Vietnamese jungle, it was a beautifully laminated death certificate. Picture it. You're a Green Beret, Fort Bragg's pride, a man who can build a guerrilla army out of dust and bad intentions. You've got radios that can summon thunder, air power that can erase hillsides, and a supply chain so rich it can ship comfort into hell. You step off a helicopter believing you're the sharpest blade in the room. And then an ally stops you. Not with courtesy, not with respect. With fear, not fear of the enemy, fear of you. Because while you were trained to dominate with noise, these men were trained to become the silence itself. And on one sticky morning in 1967, in Phuoc Tuy province, a US Special Forces captain learned that $1 million worth of training could still get you killed, if it taught you the wrong habits. The air in southern Vietnam didn't feel like air. It felt like a warm, wet hand pressed over your mouth. Humidity clung to everything: skin, fabric, metal. The jungle breathed rot and life at the same time. Fermenting leaves, stagnant water, distant smoke from cooking fires, and that sour-sweet scent of earth that has been soaked for 1,000 years. Captain James Miller knew that smell better than he knew his own kids' birthdays. 3 tours, ranger school, unconventional warfare courses. His personnel file read like a brochure for American competence. He walked like a man who'd been told, by officers, instructors, and history itself, that he belonged to the winning side. The Pentagon had sent him with a mission that sounded polite on paper and arrogant in practice: inspect the Australians. Specifically, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, fewer than 200 men in country, operating in small patrols, somehow producing results that made entire American battalions look clumsy. They were finding enemy units without getting found. They were coming back alive more often than they had any right to. Miller's superiors wanted to know why. Miller had his own theory. They've been lucky, he thought, or they've been cautious to the point of uselessness, or they've had softer sectors, or maybe the numbers are exaggerated because everyone loves an underdog story. He imagined sunburnt Commonwealth soldiers with good intentions and limited imagination, brave, provincial, eager to learn how a superpower fights. He was still wearing that belief when the UH-1 Huey settled onto the red dirt of Nui Dat Base with a roar that shook his ribs. The rotor wash whipped dust into a storm. Grit lashed his face like needles. The helicopter's scream filled the world, and then, slowly, began to fade, leaving behind the jungle's lower, older sound. Insects, distant birds, leaves shifting like whispering paper. Miller jumped down, boots sinking slightly into wet earth. His rucksack sat on his back like a promise. His gear was immaculate, straps squared, buckles aligned, equipment packed with the confidence of a man who believed order could tame chaos. He adjusted his load-bearing harness and scanned for a reception. He expected something: a formation, a salute, an officer stepping forward, clipboard in hand, a crisp report delivered in crisp English. At least a nod that acknowledged he was an American captain, one of the war's supposed experts. Instead, he saw them, a small group at the tree line, and the first instinct he felt wasn't respect. It was the reflex to check his rifle. They didn't look like soldiers who lived near a base. They looked like men who had been swallowed by the jungle and then spat back out only when it got bored. Their uniforms were stained beyond color, fabric faded into a gray-green that matched leaves and shadow. Their faces were lean, hollowed, coated in grime that seemed permanent. Thick stubble sat on cheeks like rust. Their boots weren't boots. Some wore light canvas shoes, others wore improvised footwear that looked like it had been cut from old tires. But it wasn't the rags that unnerved him. It was their eyes. No enthusiasm, no boredom, not even the tiredness Miller knew from American troops. Their eyes were flat, cold, predator calm, the look of men who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe. And nobody saluted. Nobody snapped to attention. They simply watched him, as if he were a brightly painted, noisy toy dropped into a cage where the animals had stopped being impressed by tricks. Then the smell hit him. Not diesel, not gun oil, not the familiar chemical tang of a motor pool. This was organic, heavy, thick, alive. It was sweat that had aged without soap. It was damp earth, decaying leaves, a faint sharp note like fermented fish sauce baked in heat for days. Under it all, something animal, something that made his brain quietly whisper, "These men belong out there." Miller suppressed a grimace. He was used to US Army hygiene standards even in war. Soap, toothpaste, bug spray, the small rituals that let civilization pretend it was still in charge. These men didn't smell civilized. They smelled like Vietnam. One of them stepped forward. No rank insignia, no shiny bars, no name tape he could easily read. In American units, even small teams lived inside a clear hierarchy. Officers led, sergeants executed, privates learned. Here, a man who could have been anyone, from private to God, walked right up to a visiting US captain as if ranks were a rumor. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't even smile. He simply pulled out a crumpled, dirty sheet of notebook paper and shoved it toward Miller. Written in thick pencil were 5 rules. The language wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was practical. The tone you used with someone who might accidentally set himself on fire if you didn't speak plainly. 1. Do not speak unless spoken to. 2. Do not use radio without explicit permission from patrol commander. 3. Do not move unless ordered. 4. Do not touch anything, gear, foliage, ground, without permission. 5. Do not question orders, not once. Miller felt heat rise into his face. A gag order? From an ally? From a man who wouldn't even tell him his name? Everything in him bristled. His instinct was to crumple the paper and toss it back, to remind this dirt-stained phantom that the United States was not a junior partner here. He inhaled, ready to speak, and then he caught the man's gaze. Pale eyes, blue, but not bright. The kind of blue that looked washed out by too much sun and too many close calls. The eyes held no aggression, no challenge, only expectation. Like a guide watching a tourist step toward a cliff edge in beach sandals, quietly waiting for gravity to teach the lesson. That look said everything. Out there, your rank is worth nothing. Out there, your pride can kill all of us. Miller swallowed the words, and in that moment, without realizing it, he took the first step away from everything he thought he knew. The Australian pointed at Miller's rucksack and made a slicing gesture. Open it. Miller knelt, unzipped the pack, and revealed the finest portable comfort the military-industrial complex could produce. Insect repellent, soap, mint toothpaste, cigarettes, gum, chocolate, instant coffee, a small piece of America sealed in plastic and confidence. The Australian stared at the contents like a man looking at brightly colored poison. Then he started grabbing items and throwing them into the dirt. Soap first, tossed away with the disgust you'd use for a dead rat. Toothpaste next. Muddy arc, soft splash, bug spray, cigarettes, gum, chocolate, coffee. In seconds, half of Miller's carefully packed world was scattered like trash. Miller's mouth fell open. He leaned forward, furious, about to protest. Government property, mission readiness, basic respect. The Australian raised one finger to his lips, not a polite shh, a command. Silence. Miller clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. The Australian then pointed at Miller's chest, his neck, his armpits, and inhaled through his nose like a hunting dog. Then he pointed out toward the jungle. Deep, dark, endless. Scent. Miller almost laughed. The jungle was a museum of smells, rotten smoke and wet bark and animal droppings. How could a bar of soap matter in this chaos? The Australian leaned close, sniffed near Miller's collar, and made a face like he'd smelled spilled fuel. Then he mimed a Viet Cong tracker, nose lifted, eyes narrowing, finger pointing, rifle rising, and suddenly it wasn't funny, because the secret the Americans hated admitting, the secret that never looked heroic in a training film, was brutally simple. In Vietnam, an American patrol didn't have to be seen. It could be smelled. Soap made to US industrial standards left a signature that didn't exist in nature. Bug repellent evaporated chemicals into humid air. Toothpaste screamed peppermint into a world that had never known it. Deodorant, gum, coffee, all of it broadcast foreign like a flare. In humidity, those signatures carried. To trackers who had grown up in that environment, the scent of mint or factory soap wasn't subtle. It was a beacon. Some Viet Cong called it the perfume of the end. Because once they caught it, they didn't need eyes. They simply followed the trail of a civilization that couldn't stop advertising itself. The Australians had solved the problem in ways that disgusted polite men. Days before a patrol, they stopped using soap. No commercial toothpaste, no bug spray. They let natural oils build up. They rubbed vegetation into their skin. They slept where animal scent was strong. They ate local food that changed their sweat. They didn't try to smell good. They tried to smell like nothing, like jungle. And the first humiliation Miller swallowed, watching his comforts thrown into the dirt, was actually a quiet act of mercy. The Australian wasn't punishing him. He was erasing the chemical target painted on his back. They stepped out of the perimeter wire at 0400, when darkness was still thick and the air held a faint coolness that wouldn't last. Miller expected the rhythm he knew. Move fast, cover ground, reach objective before first light gives the enemy eyes. American doctrine loved speed, loved initiative, loved violence with direction, but the Australians moved like time itself had slowed. The first hour covered maybe 300 meters. 300. Miller could walk that distance on a sidewalk back home in 4 minutes while sipping coffee and complaining about traffic. Here, 60 minutes crawled by and he could still see the faint glow of base lights behind him. The Australians didn't push through vegetation. They flowed around it. They found gaps that already existed, and when they passed, the jungle closed behind them as if nobody had ever been there. Every few minutes they froze. Not slowed. Frozen. 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 5, 10. In those moments, even insects seemed to hesitate. The patrol became part of the scenery. Breath shallow, muscles locked, eyes alive. Miller's frustration built like pressure in a boiler. By 0600, they had covered perhaps 500 meters. His mind screamed, "You're wasting darkness. You're losing initiative. You're giving the enemy time." He leaned toward the pale-eyed sergeant and whispered, unable to help himself, "We need to pick it up. We'll miss the window." The response was immediate. Without turning, the Australian extended an arm and pressed his palm downward, flattening the air, forcing Miller's words into the dirt. Sit. Be silent. Wait. It wasn't humiliation like an insult. It was humiliation like a leash. And Miller felt for the first time in years like a trainee again. sudden, like a man who'd walked into the wrong classroom. Then came the radio. As day dragged on, Miller reached for his handset instinctively. In American units, regular situation reports weren't optional. Missing check-ins triggered concern, then panic, then rescue attempts. The radio was comfort. The radio was civilization. The radio meant you weren't alone. A hand caught his wrist. Iron grip. The sergeant's pale eyes held one word. No. Then the Australian drew one finger across his own throat. Transmit and die. Miller wanted to argue. Encryption, secure frequencies, modern equipment, the Pentagon's miracles. But he remembered Rule 5. Do not question orders. That night, the Australians established their hide without sending a single word. Miller lay in the dark, listening to silence so deep it pressed on his eardrums. He felt abandoned, as if the war had cut the cord that connected him to everything human. Later, he would learn the Australian logic. Patrol leaders operated with autonomy. Headquarters did not babysit. They accepted uncertainty because uncertainty kept men alive. When they had to communicate, they used tiny bursts, button clicks, coded taps, signals too short for direction-finding teams to triangulate. Because by 1967, Viet Cong signals intelligence wasn't primitive. They had captured radios, studied procedures, learned the rhythm of American reporting. They waited for the scheduled transmission, triangulated the position, moved ambush elements into place, waited for the next transmission to confirm, and then snapped the trap shut. American patrols disappeared that way. The higher command knew. But institutions don't like admitting their habits are killing people, so they kept transmitting, and the jungle kept collecting payments. On the fourth morning, the heat rose early, as if the ground itself was angry. The patrol had been moving for 2 hours at that surgical pace. Miller's calves ached, his shoulders burned. Every step required unnatural control. Condensation dripped from giant leaves in slow, rhythmic taps. Somewhere far away, a gibbon called like a taunt. Then the point man froze, not a casual pause, a statue. His fist clenched and rose. Halt. The signal rippled back. Bodies sank. Miller pressed himself into red mud and rotting leaves until dampness soaked through his uniform. Mosquitoes landed on his skin and fed. He wasn't allowed to swat. Every itch became a test of discipline. For long minutes, there was nothing. Then the jungle opened. Men appeared on a narrow trail that intersected the Australians' route, less than 40 meters away. Not farmers, not half-trained guerrillas, North Vietnamese regulars. They moved with confidence that chilled Miller's blood. Their rifles were clean, their gear orderly. They carried AK-47s with curved magazines, RPGs slung like casual tools, an RPD machine gun with a drum magazine that looked hungry. Miller counted 12, 16, 20 more. A reinforced platoon moving south toward American positions. Every lecture at Fort Bragg lit up inside his skull. Perfect ambush. They were in cover. Enemy was exposed. Range was close. Surprise complete. Miller's finger twitched near the safety selector of his M16. His mind started writing the after-action report before a shot was fired. Enemy force engaged. Decisive results. Weapons captured. This was body count heaven. The kind of numbers that turned into promotions and speeches. He looked to the Australian sergeant for the signal. He expected movement, quiet shifting, arcs of fire, a whispered countdown. What he saw stopped his breath. Nothing. The Australians didn't raise weapons, didn't adjust positions, didn't even glance at Miller. They simply watched the enemy column pass like shadows sliding through sunlight, close enough that Miller could smell them: harsh tobacco, damp cotton, metallic gun oil. He could hear fragments of conversation, laughter, complaints, talk of food. They had no idea death was lying in the leaves, and the Australians did nothing. Miller's instincts didn't just disagree, they rebelled. Letting a platoon walk away felt like sacrilege, cowardice, failure, dereliction. Back in an American briefing room, it would be unforgivable. But the Australians weren't in a briefing room. They were in a jungle where noise summoned mortars and pride summoned graves. The last soldier, a rear guard with a radio pack, vanished into foliage. The trail swallowed the column. Silence returned. Miller lay shaking, adrenaline and fury fighting for space in his chest. When the sergeant finally signaled movement, Miller crawled close, eyes blazing. "Why didn't we take them?" he hissed, barely holding his voice down. The sergeant's expression didn't change much, but something like pity flickered behind those pale eyes. He whispered, low and flat. "Because you're thinking like a boxer." Miller blinked. The sergeant pulled out a map, smoothed it with a dirty hand, and tapped a point. "They want you to shoot." He tapped another. "You shoot, you stay. You stay, they fix you." Another tap. Then this comes. His finger drew an invisible circle. Mortars, reinforcements, flankers, the jungle closes. Miller stared. The sergeant continued, voice rough as bark. "You kill 20, then you die with them." He pointed in the direction the column had gone. "But if we watch them, we learn." His nail traced a thin line. "We follow. We find where they sleep, where they eat, where they store radios, where they keep the big stuff." He leaned closer, almost gentle now, but colder than before. "Bodies are trophies. Information is victory." Miller sat back, stunned. He had been hunting knockouts. The Australians were playing chess. They would sacrifice the moment to win the war they were actually fighting. The war of survival and intelligence, not the war of numbers on a chart. And in that instant, Miller felt something crack inside him. Not his courage, his worldview. 2 hours later, the jungle turned wrong. Birds quieted. The air felt watched. The sergeant halted the line with a small signal. Danger. Not ahead, behind. They were being tracked. For Miller, that was nightmare math. A tracked patrol becomes an ambush patrol. The American impulse screamed, move fast, gain distance, call for help. But there would be no sprinting, no radio. The Australians did something that felt insane. They turned back. They executed a tight loop, a button hook, moving parallel to their own trail, then cutting in to overlook it. They flattened into dead leaves, muzzles covering the corridor of footprints, breathing slowed until time itself seemed to hold. Minutes dragged, sweat crawled down faces, insects landed and stayed. Then 3 figures appeared, stepping into the trackway like professionals walking into a workshop, trackers, men trained to read bent grass and broken twigs like scripture. One crouched, studying a mark in mud. Another scanned forward, eyes sharp, patient. The third moved with the quiet certainty of a man who knew the jungle could confess if you asked the right questions. One tracker paused close enough that Miller could see grime under fingernails. The man leaned forward, studying a single crushed leaf. Miller felt his throat tighten. One cough, one careless breath, one nervous shift, and the jungle would explode. The Australians didn't twitch. They let the trackers work, let them stare, confer in silent gestures, and move on, still believing the quarry was ahead. The patrol had not escaped by running. They had escaped by rewiring the hunt, and Miller understood the sick joke. In this jungle, the loud man is the victim. The impatient man is the victim. The man who needs to prove something is the victim. Survival belonged to the unbearable discipline of men who could lie still while danger walked past. But Vietnam wasn't finished teaching. It never was. Late in the day, they entered elephant grass that rose over 2 meters high. Visibility collapsed to arm's length. The world became a green tunnel, leaves slapping shoulders, stalks whispering against gear. This was collision terrain, the kind of place where 2 forces could meet suddenly and turn surprise into slaughter. It happened in a blink. Figures appeared ahead, close enough to see faces before the brain could label them as enemy. 8 Viet Cong in black pajamas, chest rigs heavy with grenades. Shock hit both sides at once, a fraction of a second of shared disbelief, like 2 predators realizing they'd walked into the same narrow cave. Miller's instincts surged. Dig in, base of fire, flank, hold ground, call the cavalry. American doctrine wanted you to own the contact. The Australians did not own it. They detonated and vanished. Go, 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 the sergeant barked. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. All 5 Australians opened fire simultaneously. Not careful shots, not polite bursts. A single violent wall of lead, rifles at waist height, magazines emptied in a roar that turned elephant grass into shredded confetti. The sound slammed into Miller's chest like a physical thing. The VC dove for the dirt, blind firing, terrified, convinced they'd stumbled into a much larger force. Miller fired too, adrenaline making his M16 chatter. He was ready to reload, to throw a grenade, to surge forward and finish the fight the right way. Then the Australians' gunfire stopped as suddenly as it began. Miller turned. The space beside him was empty. They were gone. Not fallen back to reload. Gone. Moving fast, flowing backward down the trail, cutting through the green maze like water finding a crack. Move, yank! The sergeant yelled from behind, waving violently. Miller's mind snapped in confusion. We're winning. They're pinned. Why are we running? It felt wrong. Shameful. Like retreat. But he ran. He ran until his lungs burned like they were filled with fire ants. He ran past vines that tore his sleeves, past slick roots that tried to break ankles, past the part of himself that wanted to be heroic in the old stupid way. They sprinted 500 meters, then hooked left, then right, then dropped into a bamboo thicket and formed a tight perimeter. Silence returned. Heavy, gasping silence. Miller collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, sweat pouring. He looked at the sergeant, ready to accuse him of cowardice. The sergeant held up a hand. Listen. Miller froze. From the contact site behind them came the sound of war arriving late. Thump, 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 mortars, then the rattle of heavy machine guns, then explosions, grenades chewing the elephant grass into smoke and torn leaves. The Viet Cong were hammering the place where Miller's instincts would have kept them fixed. The sergeant's mouth twitched into something like a grim smile. That's the follow-on, he whispered. They were close, parallel, waiting. Miller felt cold run through him. If we stayed 2 minutes, the sergeant continued, calm as a teacher, we'd be under that barrage. He watched Miller absorb it, then added the lesson like a nail. They hug the belt. They get close, they fix you, then they pile on. Mortars, heavy stuff. They don't mind losing 8 men to lock you in place. He gestured back at the jungle, where explosions kept tearing up emptiness. We denied them the target. The Australians checked magazines, faces blank, already back in their quiet world. We're not here to hold territory, the sergeant said. We're here to kill and go home. There's no prize for dying on elephant grass. Miller stared at his shaking hands, not shaking from fear, shaking from the realization of how close he had come to dying because his training had demanded pride. His doctrine would have turned that contact into a battle, a long one, a loud one, a heroic one, and heroes in Vietnam often became statistics. The Australians had fired to overwhelm senses, to create the illusion of numbers, then vanished before the trap could close. They hadn't fled. They had refused to be fixed. And that refusal, so offensive to American concepts of honor, was the most professional thing Miller had ever seen. On extraction day, the helicopter's rotors felt like a violation. After days of enforced silence, the sound was obscene, an announcement to every living thing in the jungle that men were here, loud and fragile. Miller climbed aboard with a body scraped raw and a mind rewritten. Back at Nui Dat, he did what honest best men do when they've been humiliated by truth. He wrote it down. Not romance, not excuses, not lessons learned in polite language. He wrote movement discipline, scent control, radio silence, patience as a weapon, contact drills designed to break the enemy's plan rather than satisfy your pride. He wrote the philosophy in plain ink. The only fair fight is the one you walk away from. The report was long, pages of detail, diagrams, observations, and the kind of uncomfortable conclusions institutions hate. And then the system did what systems do when a document threatens their self-image. It stamped it, filed it, buried it. Because the war machine wanted numbers that looked good on charts, not methods that required humility. It wanted noise, not silence. It wanted battles it could explain in press briefings, not invisible patrols that refused to play by expected rules. Years later, pieces of those ideas would reappear in new manuals, after new wars forced new lessons, as if they had been discovered rather than ignored. Different jungles, different deserts, different flags, same truth. Survival belongs to the quiet, the patient, and the ruthless in their discipline. And Captain Miller never forgot the man with pale blue eyes, the sergeant who didn't need speeches, medals, or arguments in a briefing room. He taught an American captain the whole doctrine with a crumpled piece of paper, a handful of mud, and a look that said, "Shut up and watch."